we can watch this video critiquing me from my former classmate, who's a liberal, who's got this channel here, the Progressive American. Yeah, basically critiquing me for my views on Russia. Oh, sorry, I didn't switch my camera around. So this is it, the Progressive American. If y'all agree with Connor's or the Progressive American's views, you can give him a follow. If you're more of a neolib, he probably would reject the label of neoliberal. But so yeah, I knew this person from college. They worked for the Warren campaign, Elizabeth Warren, when I was working for the Bernie campaign. But we always got along. I got no problem with this person or with them making the video. The only thing that I was kind of salty about is apparently they used the video from my personal Snapchat. So I put like a video on my personal Snapchat story, basically trying to explain to people what was going down in context with Russia and Ukraine. Not saying anything about Putin or whether I support him at all. You know, I said, you know, you can choose whether you support the Russian invasion or not. It's a terrible situation. You know, war is terrible in all cases, but here's the context and here's the justification that Putin gave for invading. So he recorded that off my personal Snapchat, I guess, and used it in this video, which I haven't seen, but dude, what a dick move. That's not my public TikTok. That's not my public Midwestern Marks account. That's the account that I use to talk to my parents and my buddies from high school. Don't take stuff from my private social media accounts that you have to add me as a friend to see. But other than that, you know, whatever. We've always obviously disagreed politically, so no problem with him making a response video voicing his disagreements.
Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing well. Throughout the last several weeks, various media outlets and content creators have dealt with an ever-changing and increasingly disturbing news cycle thanks to the war in Ukraine. Whether it's legacy media like CNN or MSNBC or freelance journalists, everyone in modern media has had to deal with the reality of wartime coverage. But another media world has had to deal with that same reality in its own way. This world of independent streamers and online pundits has taken on a new life as the war in Ukraine has unfolded. Through their various perspectives and outlooks, these pundits and streamers have dealt with the war in their own way, some good and controlled, and others not so much. But among these pundits, one has stuck out as particularly apologetic for Russia's involvement in Ukraine.
I'm kind of salty he called me a pundit also. I don't see myself as a pundit. I'm definitely just a wrestler and a communist who makes online videos with the free time that I have. So maybe that makes me a pundit, but I don't like the identity label of online internet media pundit, but I guess that's what I am.
One has stuck out as particularly apologetic for Russia's involvement in Ukraine, Eddie Liger-Smith. For those unfamiliar with Eddie and his content, he's one of the main hosts of the Midwestern Marks YouTube channel, and
for those unfamiliar with Eddie, I went to college with him. Here's clips from his personal Snapchat that I took. I'm glad he didn't upload any videos of me shot. Thank you, Connor.
Occasional author on the Midwestern Marks website, along with several other writers. Over the last several months, he's released a series of videos on Russia and Ukraine from the beginning of the war's buildup to its eventual current state. Like Hassan, he's let his distrust of American intelligence blind him to the clear and present danger that Russia's hypernationalism posed, and through that distrust, he is
Like Hassan? Like Hassan Piker? I think this is the first time in my life I've ever been lumped together with Hassan Piker. Usually I'm considered to be more of an anti-imperialist, and Hassan's considered more of like a mainstream sort of socialist, who's not, you know, hyper skeptical of every U.S. narrative about geopolitics. You know, he focuses a lot on domestic politics. I think he was a Bernie person. Yeah, usually I'm considered more edgy or more of a Marxist-Leninist than Hassan, who's just considered more of a basic Marxist, I guess. But maybe his take on Russia, Ukraine has been different. I don't know. Maybe people in the chat let me know. Because I'm just surprised this is the first time I've heard myself compared to Hassan Piker.
continued to throw away his credibility through evasion, obfuscation, and blatant apologia. Through his content, Eddie follows a consistent pattern that renders his analysis inaccurate, and despite his objections, his work unwittingly lends itself to the Russian cause of war. Earlier this year, Eddie, like many lefties, didn't believe that the Russians would invade Ukraine. In his first video, titled Russia, Ukraine, and US Imperialism, Eddie argued that the Russian government was not going to invade because they were moving troops within their own borders, and that the media was just trying to manufacture a conflict.
Many people have asked for a video about the ongoing situation between Ukraine, Russia, the US, and other NATO countries. Western mainstream media outlets are saying that Russia is increasing aggression towards Ukraine and may invade at any time, which could prompt the US to come to Ukraine's defense. Russian aggression was the justification used by Joe Biden and the US State Department for increasing weapons and arms shipments to Eastern Europe. Biden even floated the idea of having NATO countries send 50,000 troops, tanks, missiles, and aircrafts to threaten Russia.
So part of this is true, but he's also missing the point that I was making there. So I didn't think Russia was going to invade. I underestimated the stage of multipolarity that the world is at. I underestimated how much Russia was going to say F you to the U.S. And basically send troops into Ukraine. I didn't expect them to go ahead and do that. I thought it might be a possibility. I talked about Russia sending troops into Donbass in eastern Ukraine in order to, stop the shelling and the killing of Russian people that had been going on there, with 14,000 Russians being killed since 2014 with the U.S.-backed coup, or the U.S.-backed revolution, as they called it. But the point I was making was that the U.S. are the aggressors here, right? Because the U.S. narrative is that Russia are the aggressors. Putin are the aggressors. Look at how they're moving their troops at this point, before Russia had invaded. Look at how they're moving their troops. And what I'm saying in this video is Russia is moving their troops within their own border. They're moving their troops within their own border in a defensive position against Ukraine in response to NATO increasingly approaching Russia's borders after promising not to, lying to Russia and the Russian people, and surrounding the Russian troops with weapons and with troops, while also continually looking to destabilize and control Ukraine and eventually make Ukraine a NATO member country, again expanding NATO right up to Russia's borders. So my point wasn't that Russia wasn't going to invade because their troops had a defensive posture. My point was that the U.S. and NATO are the aggressors here, that Russia's troops are inside their own borders. The American troops, the NATO troops, are lined up outside of Russia's borders. If Russia was lining up their troops along the Canadian border, you think that we would be the aggressors there? That would be us being aggressive towards Russia if we sent troops, to face the Canadian troops within our own borders? No, that's not, that wouldn't be the U.S. being the aggressors. And the U.S. surrounding Russia's borders with troops and weapons was the U.S. being the aggressors. And yes, the media was creating a conflict. The U.S. involvement in Ukraine and the U.S. media narrative led to this war, this intervention happening. And if you're so against the war or the intervention, Connor, you should be skeptical about that, and you should be skeptical about NATO lining Russia's borders with troops.
Here's an article from the corporate-owned Washington Post, which says Russia moves troops and the U.S. sends weapons to Ukraine in response.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. Russia used troops. U.S. Sends weapons as fear of war mounts in Ukraine. Yeah, Russia was moving their troops, but why weren't there Washington Post articles when the U.S. was moving their troops right to Russia's borders? Why wasn't the Washington Post scared about war happening when the U.S. did that? And the answer is because the Washington Post will never portray the U.S. as the aggressors. The Washington Post will never portray the U.S. as the instigators. They're owned by Jeff Bezos. They're corporate media. They are stenographers to power.
Within their own borders. Because of course Russia and Ukraine share a border. So as the US funnels weapons and threatens to send troops into Ukraine, Russia is preparing themselves and moving their troops along this border.
When I first saw this video, I couldn't help but feel it foreshadowed something concerning, something I had seen in other left-wing creators before. Eddie's self-explained distrust of the intelligence community led him to believe that an invasion wouldn't occur, and that distrust alone would be excusable if it weren't for the way he handles media reporting. Keen-eyed viewers may have noticed how Eddie presents his sources and modern media, namely that he creates a division between traditional press and the Midwestern Mark's articles that he presents. He does this by partially showing the headlines to the articles he cites, labeling them as some sort of corporate press in order to cast doubt on their reporting. With that out of the way, Eddie can present outlets like the Washington Post as if they are omitting key information from the stories he cites. For example, he presents this story, Russia moves troops and US sends weapons as fear of war mounts in Ukraine, as an example of these omissions. Eddie claims that the Post and other outlets didn't mention that the Russian forces were operating in their own territory. There's just one problem. He didn't read it, or scroll down.
Okay, he's missing the point that I was making here. I've rewatched that TikTok a bunch, and I don't believe that I said the Post omitted the info that Russia was lining up troops outside of Ukraine's border. But if I did say that the Post omitted that specific information, that was a mistake. But the main point that I was making wasn't that Russia won't invade Ukraine and the US media is trying to make it seem like they might invade Ukraine. My point was that the situation was escalating closer and closer to armed conflict, largely because of NATO and US escalation. So I was saying the Post releases an article when Russia moves troops within their own borders, but where were the articles when NATO troops were at Russia's borders? Where was the mention of the NED funneling millions of dollars into Ukraine before the 2014 overthrow of a pro-Russian president? What I was saying in that TikTok is not that the article omitted the geographical location of Russian troops, but it omitted the history of NATO expansion and US aggression towards Russia, which caused them to move their troops. I wasn't arguing that armed conflict was impossible, I was arguing that the US was bringing us closer to it through their meddling in Eastern Europe.
If you read the actual article, you can see that it never claimed Russia was moving troops into Ukraine, and they did mention that the Russian troops are in their own borders, at least at the time. And it wasn't like this was a hard thing to find in the article. It was within the first 3 paragraphs. You could have gone down within less than a minute and found the information you were looking for. And that's part of the issue with how Eddie portrays media. The narrative he spins or creates is part of this idea that the media is lying to you, and in doing so, he can ignore other issues involving countries' movements and motivations that don't just demonize the United States. And this is on perfect display with the Financial Times article he pointed to in that same video. If Eddie had read some of it, he would have noticed how it argued that Russian officials, such as Vladimir Putin, fear democratic norms and prefer to establish their own traditionalist norms in government. Now you can argue over whether or not the US should be the one to address that, but to avoid discussing it altogether and treating it as though the US is the singular problem in this conflict ignores the intentions of other countries like Russia. And this is precisely why Eddie failed to see the potential danger in the Russian troop deployments. Had Eddie ever shown or even looked at the Washington Post map, he would have noticed the positions that Russian troops were originally deployed in. He would have seen.
I literally showed that map and the location of Russian troops in the TikTok you're critiquing. I had the map on a green screen behind me and I showed where the Russian troops were lining up within their own borders but outside Ukraine. But it's clear that you're upset that I wasn't hyper-focused on the motivations and intentions of Vladimir Putin, who liberals think is a human comic book villain. And you're so intent on just demonizing Putin in this conflict that you are missing the extensive role that Western imperialism has played in escalating things. And the way in which corporate media omits key facts about U.S. involvement and the involvement of the Western imperialist bloc. Watch Oliver Stone's Ukraine on Fire, and then go watch the Netflix movie on Ukraine, and you can see how selective facts and choosing to report on specific historical developments while choosing to omit others can change how you see this conflict. By example, many American or many Western mainstream media outlets will call the 2014 or 2013 Euromaidan protest a revolution, and just leave it at that, with no mention of the $3 million plus that was funneled into Ukraine and pro-US groups in Ukraine leading up to that by the NED, an arm of the US State Department. So my argument that I'm making, and the one that I was making in that TikTok, isn't that the media is lying, as in the media is just making up a bunch of fabricated facts all the time. What I mean is that they select certain facts in order to create a narrative in which the Western imperialist bloc can never be viewed as the aggressors. Any outlet that doesn't mention the U.S. involvement in Ukraine leading up to the Euromaidan protests is essentially lying by omission, right? Or any outlet that doesn't mention that NATO and the U.S. promised to stop expanding towards Russia, but then continually expanded towards Russia as Russia decided to ally closer with China and go against the U.S. Economically. NATO has continued to expand towards Russia as that has happened. They've continued to threaten to destabilize Russia, which is largely what has led to this war in Ukraine and this conflict coming about. And that was the point I was making. And yes, the media is pushing a narrative about this. It's not that the media is lying to you as in I'm a conspiracy theorist who thinks, they're fabricating everything or doing false flags all the time. What I'm saying is that the media is pushing a narrative in which the U.S. are not the aggressors in the situation, which is ridiculous. As I've said a million times, imagine if Russia continued to expand their military alliance into Canada, and they wanted to add Mexico into the Russian military alliance so that they could line up troops outside the U.S.'s borders. That would be an extremely aggressive act, and that's what the U.S. has done towards Russia, and that is the key point that U.S. media often omits. Neoliberals can go back and look at my TikToks warning that a conflict was going to happen and that the U.S. media was going to call Russia the aggressors despite us lining their borders with troops. They can look back at videos of me saying that and be like, oh, look, he's lying. He's an apologist for Putin. I told you exactly what was going to happen. That doesn't mean I like Putin. I don't like Putin. I made a bunch of anti-Putin videos. The Communist Party in Russia got second in the last election. That's who I support. But the Communist Party in Russia is also extremely skeptical of the U.S. narrative surrounding this conflict right now, because they realize the U.S. is lying about it. And they realize that NATO interventionism and U.S. interventionism helped create this conflict, and now the U.S. media is acting like it was 100% Russia's fault. And since the beginning, that's what I've been saying. And neolibs can really look back at what I said, and they can look back at videos of me saying there's going to be a conflict here, and the U.S. media is going to call Russia the aggressors. Like, this is what's wrong with Eddie. He just loves Putin.
That they had clear targets in mind. It should go without saying that this map shows that the Russian government was, to some extent, intent on encircling Ukrainian positions and taking large swaths of the country, as they are now trying to do. But instead...
Of course they were! Of course! That's the country the U.S. was trying to add to NATO! Did you not listen to anything I actually said in those videos? Did you ignore everything I actually said and then just notice how it goes against liberal media or nitpick certain arguments so you could try and tear them apart? Of course they lined their border with troops across Ukraine. That's the country the U.S. in 2013 funneled a bunch of money into to put an anti-Russian leader in power. That's the country who they were trying to add to NATO. Right? Just because Russia put their troops along the Ukrainian border doesn't mean they were the aggressors. Because the U.S. has also been trying to destabilize Belarus, and the U.S. has been lining Russia's borders with troops. So where is Russia supposed to put their troops then? If the U.S. are the if my argument is that the U.S. are the aggressors and NATO are the aggressors, and that they were lining Russia's borders with troops, and that that then caused Russia to also line their borders with troops inside their own borders. And Ukraine is the country that the U.S. is trying to add to NATO. Why would Russia not line up their troops along the Ukrainian border? I mean, this is common sense. That doesn't prove that Russia are the aggressors because they lined up their troops where the U.S. had also lined up their NATO weapons and their NATO troops. Right? That doesn't mean that Russia are the aggressors because those troops happen to be around Ukraine. Of course they were around Ukraine. The U.S. Helped do regime change in Ukraine and then said we're going to add them to NATO so we can launch destabilization efforts into Russia. Of course that's where they put their troops. That doesn't mean they're aggressive. He's confused because he thinks the whole point of my argument, he thinks what I'm saying is that Russia was never going to invade Ukraine, that there was no chance they were going to do that. When I repeatedly said that Russia was going to enter eastern Ukraine at least, they were going to enter the Donbass region, and as it looked more and more like Russia was going to go further than that, that's what I said as the evidence revealed that. But he thinks I was just arguing at this point that there was no chance Russia was going to invade. When in fact I was saying the U.S. destabilization efforts in Ukraine and the NATO efforts to expand towards Russia and meddle in Eastern Europe are going to create a conflict. They're going to cause either, the U.S. is either going to launch something into Russia or Russia is going to lash out.
Eddie, and others like him failed to consider the reality of the situation because they let their distrust and their paranoia guide them instead of critically examining the claims on a case-by-case basis. Now, I get why someone wouldn't want to trust major media outlets, but this is asinine. When you have clear evidence and clear examination...
So, this is kind of what I was talking about, where he says he wants me to hyper-focus on individualistic news stories, right? Individual news stories coming out of Ukraine, and deal with them on a case-by-case basis. You can't do that. You can't do that. You have to put it in historical context. If you hyper-focus on a case-by-case basis, you're not going to know all of the historical context which led to that case happening, right? So if you don't bring up that the U.S. State Department and the NED funneled $3 to $5 million into Ukraine before a U.S. or a pro-U.S. anti-Russian president was put in power, you're not giving the whole context of the situation. If you don't mention that the U.S. was threatening to add Ukraine to NATO, you're not giving the whole context. If you mention that Russia surrounded Ukraine's border with troops, as you just did, Connor, without mentioning that the U.S. was trying to add them to NATO and that the U.S. has been surrounding Russia's borders with troops, then you're not giving the whole story and you're misleading your audience. It's the same as lying, even though you know you're not telling a bold-faced lie. You're just lying by omission, leaving out historical context. That and the video before this one. The video I did right before this one, we were talking about a single instance in Russia. These accusations of chemical gas attacks. And we were hearing from Scott Ritter, a journalist who's now been pulled off of Twitter, give his opinion, an alternative opinion to the U.S. State Department narrative on this individual issue. So I'm totally in favor of looking at individual issues, of course, but looking at them within historical context, not on a case-by-case basis where I just hyper-focus on what the U.S. corporate media is telling me and then just take their side and say, oh, Russia's evil, they're clearly the aggressors here. Well, hold on. I can be against the Russian invasion. I can be against, Russian troops killing Ukrainian people while also saying that the U.S. and NATO have been lining Russia's border with troops, and they have been inciting this conflict for years. Both things can be true. But I guess not. Just go on a case-by-case basis. Just read what the Washington Post tells you. You'll be good.
Of facts by media outlets, you have to tackle those facts head on. Instead of making up large meta-narratives of what could be true or what intentions may exist, examining the case-by-case evidence is critical to being an informed commentator and an informed citizen when dealing with these conflicts. And Eddie, through his distrust, failed to do that. And it is this asinine approach that would eventually force Eddie to have to shift his framing, as it became increasingly clear that his original position was not only wrong, but painfully wrong. After the invasion began, Eddie switched his tone, going out of his way to downplay the violation of Ukraine.
That is so scummy, Connor. I'm losing all the respect that I had for you previously. Eddie switched his tone, and then he switches to this. This is my personal Snapchat, you You stole this from my personal Snapchat. Eddie changed his tone because he was wrong. I changed my tone because I wasn't talking to a public audience anymore. I was talking to my friends and family, you moron. And you took this video of me talking to my friends and family, compared it to these videos of me talking on TikTok to people I've never met in my life, and you said, look how much Eddie changed his tone. This is because I was trying to be more approachable to regular people who don't follow politics every day. And I was trying to not push a narrative so that people can decide, versus on my TikTok, everybody knows I'm a communist. Right? Everybody knows I'm a communist, and everybody watching my content is somewhat informed and interested in politics. But on my personal Snapchat, which I'm now going to delete you from, Connor, I have a different approach. I have an approach as if I was talking to my conservative uncle at Christmas or something. And that's why I have a different tone. Not because I realized I was so horribly wrong and I needed to fall in line with the neoliberal narrative. Duh.
Ukraine's territorial integrity in a later video he released on his Snapchat.
I don't mean to get super political on you all, but I was reading this article from USA Today.
I didn't release it on my Snapchat. I posted it because some wrestlers wanted to know what was going on in Russia, Ukraine. They wanted to know my opinion on it. And because so many people were texting me, not just wrestlers, but friends and family, but so many people were texting me about it, I decided to put something on my story for them. In private, which is now on YouTube, thanks to you.
Today, and it doesn't even mention why Russia entered Ukraine, and it doesn't mention the historical development that led to this intervention, and it just talks about Putin, and it's so typical of liberal media. It's we just focus on these great men of history, right? So if Russia does something, there's no political and historical development that led to Russia doing this. It's just Putin did this, and here's what Biden said about it. They focus on the great men of history rather than actually informing people about what's going on.
It is worth noting that in the path of 2 videos, Eddie's position has changed from "they will never invade and the media is lying to you" to "the media is not explaining why Russia is invading." And as if to obfuscate that reality,
when did I ever say they weren't going to invade? There was one point I remember where the media was saying Russia had invaded, like Kyle Kalinske said that before Russia actually invaded. But the whole point of those videos that you were critiquing, Connor, which apparently you didn't listen to, was saying that this is going to create a conflict. Was that if this keeps escalating, there's going to be a conflict created here, and the U.S. media is going to blame it all on Russia, even though the U.S. has played a role in creating this conflict. That was the point of what I was saying. No, I didn't think Russia was going to invade. No, I did not think Russia was actually going to send troops into Ukraine. As I said, I thought they were still, too scared of the U.S. and what the U.S. retaliation was going to be in order to do so. I was wrong about that. We're moving towards a multipolar world where the U.S. no longer completely dominates the geopolitical world order. Russia gave a big FU to the U.S. by invading Ukraine. It's a horrible conflict. But not, I never said it was impossible that they would invade. And the whole purpose of my commentary was saying that this is going to lead to a conflict. And the U.S. media is going to say it's all Russia's fault. And that's what happened. And that's what you're doing right now. That's literally what you're doing right now by also looking at my previous content and lying. Saying that Russia's just this defensive, that I was arguing that Russia's this defensive country who would never send troops anywhere. That's not what I was saying. I was saying a conflict is brewing here. But the idea that it's only Russia's fault is absolutely insane. And that's true. That's just true.
he points to NATO, seemingly forgetting that the government that took power in 2014 was hesitant about joining it.
All right, so people ask me for an explanation. Basically, in the 90s, the U.S. promised to stop expanding NATO, which is like this military agreement between the U.S. and other European countries. So this was after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russia was like, you have to stop expanding NATO towards us. The U.S. did not stop expanding.
And he mentioned there that Ukraine was skeptical about joining NATO. Yeah, the idea has only been floated. Because Ukraine realized if they join NATO, Russia might invade them. That Russia had said multiple times, do not join NATO. Do not join NATO. We are not okay with Ukraine joining NATO. And that if the U.S. kept pushing for Ukraine to join NATO, it was gonna lead to a conflict, which is what happened. But of course the Ukrainian president was hesitant about joining NATO. He knew it might have led to this. That doesn't mean that it's not NATO's fault at all.
NATO. Now, recently, the U.S. has wanted to add Ukraine to NATO, and Ukraine has wanted to be added to NATO. And Russia said, no, you're going to use Ukraine once they become part of NATO to launch interventions, like regime change efforts into Russia. So we don't want this, but the U.S. has wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. It's been this big thing.
Eddie then moves from
the USSR. Did you see what he said at the bottom there? The USSR had already collapsed, so why would Russia be worried about their government being overthrown? Which, it was post-1992, where after the Soviet Union dissolved, how did he miss the point this bad? After the Soviet Union dissolved, the U.S. said we're no longer going to expand NATO. They lied, and they've increasingly expanded NATO as Russia has nationalized certain industries, including their natural gas, and including starting to trade with people who used to buy oil from U.S. companies, which has angered the U.S. Russia has moved towards economic policy under Putin, which is more similar to what they had during the time of the Soviet Union. So the U.S. has gone back on their promise, lied, and continued expanding NATO, threatening Russia, which is an act of aggression. So how does the fact that the USSR was crumbling at this point prove that the U.S. didn't lie about NATO expansion? And why do you not think that the U.S. could be aggressive towards Russia, that they could only be aggressive towards the USSR? This is the time when the U.S. was saying they weren't going to expand NATO, because the USSR dissolved and they're like, oh, we're good now, right? The Soviet Union's gone, we'll deal with Russia. But as Russia has increasingly gone economically left, the U.S. has increasingly expanded NATO, which is an act of aggression which threatens Russia. The fact that the Soviet Union dissolved helps make my point. It helps put my point within historical context. Thank you, Connor.
But the U.S. has wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. It's been this big thing.
Eddie then moves from blaming NATO to yet another claim that distracts from the illegal war that he failed to predict, falsely claiming that Donetsk and Luhansk chose independence freely and that there was no interference by the Russian government.
Basically, these two regions of Donbass recently voted to become independent. independent republics as all this hostility was increasing between NATO and Russia.
He reiterated much of these points after he released another video reacting to 2 videos by Caleb Maupin and Jackson Hinkle. During the video, he repeatedly claims that the inhabitants of Donetsk and Luhansk willingly separated from Ukraine to defend themselves from far-right ethnic violence.
Acknowledging a Russian invasion into Ukraine, because here's the deal, folks, and you're not going to see this in the mainstream press, but let me just show you.
Yeah, that's a good point by Jackson. Even the mainstream media at this point was not saying Russia invaded Ukraine. Kyle went ahead with that clickbait title because he knew it would get views. The US media was saying stuff like, Russian troops pour into Ukraine, right? Russian troops enter independent republics next to Ukraine, right? They weren't saying Russia invades Ukraine because they know that would just be a blatant lie, right? That there are these people in Donetsk and Luhansk who voted for their independence, who voted to become independent republics because they're fearing far-right ethno-nationalist violence, which the US has been supporting in Ukraine since earlier than 2014.
Watch, he's going to say the people in Donetsk and Luhansk didn't actually vote for their independence, and Putin did it. It's the same argument they made with Crimea, even when U.S. media outlets were reporting as high as 90% of people living in Crimea wanted to join Russia. U.S. media outlets were reporting that, but, the narrative now is that Russia just stole Crimea. Russia just took Crimea, even though the vast majority of people in Crimea wanted to join Russia. And it's going to be the same exact thing with Donetsk and Luhansk, despite the fact that the vast majority of people there are Russian-speaking, that there have been tons of cases of ethnic conflict in that region, largely perpetrated by the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion and other far-right-wing groups in Ukraine who have been supported by proxy by the U.S. government. And they're going to say that, Russia just rigged these elections and said, Donetsk and Luhansk, you guys get your independence, despite the fact that Russia denied independence for Donetsk and Luhansk in 2015, when they were still scared of the U.S. getting mad about it, right? So they said, no, we're not going to recognize these countries' independence, even though those countries voted for their independence. So Russia said no. Then when those countries again voted for their independence recently, Russia said yes. But apparently we're supposed to believe this has all just been Putin's master plan, is what I'm assuming he's about to say.
The reality is much more complicated. While there were attempts to secede from Ukraine back in 2014, those attempts were far from transparent, and they certainly were not what Eddie presents them as. The 2014 referendum
Yeah, they were fake.
was so hastily done that it had a litany of errors that compromised its integrity. In some cases, pro-Ukrainian activists were beaten, assaulted, and chased away, preventing them from participating. Reports also showed that there were...
Okay, what about the 14,000 Russian-speaking citizens who were killed? And, he's using reports from what? CNN? These corporate media outlets. And like I said, I'm not the kind of person who, and this wouldn't be true, to say that corporate media just lies about everything, that they make bold-faced lies, right? They take the truth and they twist it, or they take the truth and they use it to spin a narrative. They take what's true on the ground, maybe add in a few falsehoods, and then they use it to push their own narrative. And that's exactly what was going on here, right? There's irregularities in this election, this election that went the way Russia wanted it, not the U.S. That election's got irregularities. I'm pretty sure it was the Russian government. It was Putin messing with these elections. Yeah, of course CNN's going to say that, right? And of course they're going to pretend to be objective. Oh, we're just reporting the objective facts. They're not. No matter how these elections went down, Donetsk and Luhansk could have gotten 99.9% support to secede from Ukraine, and the U.S. would have accused them of voter fraud, right? It just what it is, and there probably were cases where Ukrainians were beaten at the polls, right? I'm sure that actually happened in certain cases, right? But also 14,000 Russian-speaking citizens were killed by neo-Nazi violence. So, when these elections went down, I'm sure the far right-wing people who didn't want to secede from Ukraine were also doing voter suppression, right? But what the U.S. media does is look at that and say, okay, what do we want our narrative to be? So we'll just take the facts on the ground that serve our narrative and only report those. So it's not that they're making up facts necessarily, it's that they're selectively picking and choosing facts while leaving out others in order to spin a narrative, which is exactly what they've done with Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk.
Incidents where ballots were cast multiple times.
And also, so nobody thinks I'm, big Putin apologist or whatever Connor is accusing me of being, someone who just supports Russia and is in the pocket of the Russian government. There is economic incentive for Russia to build a land bridge between Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. it would be economically beneficial for them. Do I think that weighed, in Putin's decision somewhat? I'm sure it did. Putin's decision to, support the sovereignty of Donetsk and Luhansk against the wishes of the U.S., which Russia didn't do in 2014. I'm sure part of that decision was like, yeah, we'd like to build this land bridge. I'm not saying Putin's perfect. I'm not saying Russia doesn't have their own economic incentives, which, in some ways craft their foreign policy. What I'm saying is that the U.S. media narrative about this is a complete lie. The idea that Putin is just this evil, irrational actor who was planning on invading Ukraine this whole time just so he could steal it, right? There's historical context which led to this situation, and the context within Donetsk and Luhansk is very, 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 very important, right? But I guess if you just say every report coming out of Donetsk and Luhansk that goes against the U.S. media narrative is untrue, trust me, here's a CNN article, I guess you could dismiss all of that.
The registration list was 2 years old and hadn't even been updated since then. Combining that with the fact that the ballots had no protective frills to prevent them from being opened means that this election really had no consistent standards that could be accepted by international law, much less in the courts of Ukraine. Even the voter turnout is a matter of contention.
You worked in the election with Bernie Sanders. You worked in the Iowa elections, where the voting app was designed by companies connected to the Pete Buttigieg campaign. And you saw the way that CNN and the way that American corporate media lambasted everybody who supported Medicare for All and lambasted that policy and argued on behalf of the insurance companies and argued against Bernie and tried to make him look as bad as possible. And you saw your own candidate, Elizabeth Warren, in the midst of this, change her tune on Medicare for All, stop supporting Medicare for All because she thought that would help her campaign, and then turn on Bernie and start attacking Bernie, fall in line with the establishment. But if the entire establishment and the entire media apparatus of a country teams up against one candidate, that's not an irregular election according to international law. It's only the elections that CNN told me might be fake. I mean, how naive are you?
While in Donetsk, officials claim that 89% of the registered people voted, the Ukrainian ministry puts that number as low as 32%. In Luhansk, separatists claim that...
Wow, that is hard to believe. I cannot believe the Ukrainian minister said that these pro-Russian places who seceded from Ukraine didn't have as high of a voter turnout. I wonder what incentive he would have to fudge the numbers. And even this guy is saying that 32% of the people were there. Even this Ukrainian official who has all this incentive to say that the elections were rigged.
That over 94% of the people voted for independence.
And what the hell's the voter turnout in the U.S.? It was Hillary Trump was like the last election was like the highest voter turnout we ever had. It was like 60%. Right? But you're saying you need 100% voter turnout, or you need 74.87? Like half of America doesn't vote on who the president is. Does that make it an illegitimate election?
But Ukraine's Internal Affairs Ministry put that number as low as 24%. Not only that, but Ukrainian security forces released audio recordings which they claim show Russian paramilitary leader Alexander Barkashov encouraging separatists to rig the vote and claim overwhelming support. With such a complete lack of transparency, are we really going to pretend that Ukraine doesn't have a reason to be worried about this being part of an annexation plan? Let's not be so contrarian that we can't understand why a sovereign state might feel threatened by the last several years of territorial loss largely instigated by one power, Russia. And it's not like Putin and his allies aren't willing to make up things to justify intervention in that region. Putin has repeatedly claimed that the intervention in the region was necessary because of supposed genocide against ethnic Russians. And in that same video that I showed you, Eddie has made the exact...
Oh no, the PolitiFact meter! It says false. Okay, then what is the Azov Battalion, Connor? What is the Azov Battalion, and what is their role within the Ukrainian military? If they're not, attacking people based on their ethnicity, and if they're not doing ethnic crimes and killing thousands of Russian people in a genocidal manner, then what is the Azov Battalion doing, and why are they part of Ukraine's National Guard? What is the Azov Battalion's stated goals? Is this just, a platoon that happens to be part of the Ukrainian military with some far-right politics? No. It's a neo-Nazi battalion. And not like neo-Nazis like, lefties in the US love accusing everybody of being fascists. Literal fascists. Like, they say we are fascists, we admire Stefan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator during World War II, who worked together with Hitler to kill 35,000, or to commit many massacres, including one which killed 35,000 people in Ukraine. You know, so, and when you have areas like Donetsk and Luhansk, which are like 60 to 70% Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian, and you have 14,000 deaths and constant fighting and warring, and factions warring with, or militias fighting with each other in eastern Ukraine, and one of them's the Azov Battalion, you don't think they're doing genocidal crimes? Their stated goal is to cleanse Ukraine of all non-Ukrainians. You know, and they're an armed militia. You seriously don't think they're doing genocidal crimes? You just look at politifact.com and it tells you false, and you're like, well, I got the truth now. Like, the naivety of liberals is absolutely insane, and the lack of understanding of the historical conflicts, or historical context that has led to this intervention is absolutely insane. You know, and what's so funny is I get called the genocide denier all the time. You're a genocide denier. You deny the U.S. State Department's claims of human rights abuses. You're a genocide denier. But when a liberal denies the crimes of the Azov Battalion, who tell people we are neo-Nazis, you know, when they deny the crimes against ethnic Russians and against Jewish people committed by the Azov Battalion, say, no, this isn't genocidal. That's not genocide denial? Well, then what the hell is this? Why am I the only one who gets called the genocide denier? This is genocide denial.
Exact same argument.
Kind of personal. Are you fearful of this conflict in Russia and Ukraine? I'm fearful for the people there. Like, before Donetsk and Luhansk declared their independence and became independent republics and got protection from Russia, I was really nervous that there was going to be basically a genocide or a massacre of Russian citizens in the area by these far-right forces, by the Azov Battalion or the U.S.-backed ethno-nationalist neo-Nazis. You know, I thought they were going to start massacring Russian people, but now these areas have declared their independence and Russia is protecting them, which the U.S. has called.
And as Scott Ritter discussed in the last video that we were looking at, this conflict has allowed the Azov Battalion to do a lot of horrible things. You know, not to justify anything that the Chechenian military or that the Russian military has done. They've done bad things too, for sure. But the Azov Battalion has been, like, blowing up chemical plants and using the conflict, of course, to advance their own motives, which are neo-Nazi motives. You know, and yes, that is bad. Yes, I'm against that. And yes, I'm against the Russian military, you know, killing people. I'm against I would totally be against the full seizure of Ukraine by Russia, the annexation of Ukraine by Russia. You know, I would be against that happening. And I'm against casualties to civilians. But let's not act like, you know, Ukraine isn't at fault here and like this conflict hasn't allowed the Azov Battalion to advance their own interests, which is what I was saying, you know, when the conflict was first starting out. And Connor's trying to act like that was me saying Russia is all holy, you know, and they're the good guys in this conflict because liberals have to have a bad guy and a good guy. Like, no, maybe the situation is gray. And maybe I was concerned about, you know, the citizens in general. Yeah, I don't know. I had an argument or somewhere I was going with that, but I kind of lost my train of thought. So, back to listening to myself.
An invasion, but, you know, I'm happy that those people are now going to be protected and that people are now fleeing by the thousands into Russia from these regions, which is scary and which is sad. But, you know, I hope those people get out safe. And, you know, I hope the same for Ukraine. I hope the people in Ukraine are able to kick out this U.S.-backed ethno-nationalist government and are able to move towards peace and towards mutual cooperation with their Russian neighbors.
Absolutely. I still believe that. Does anybody watch that clip and say, what a jerk? You know, first of all, I said I don't think that Russia should advance beyond Donetsk and Luhansk. So I'm against that. And I'm against, you know, bad things happening to Ukrainians. You know, but I'm also for Ukrainians having their sovereignty, right? The U.S. dumped $3 to $5 million into Ukraine before this 2014 overthrow of the Ukrainian government, which put in power a U.S.-backed leader, right? I'm against that because I support Ukrainians actually picking who their leader is. And I'm against the Azov Battalion and these other neo-Nazi battalions because they're neo-Nazis. So I want the people of Ukraine, so what I was saying was I want the people of Ukraine to kick out these neo-Nazi battalions and develop themselves economically and create a system of mutual development with Russia where no war happens. But that's not what happened. The U.S. increasingly pushed for their interests in Ukraine. They increasingly threatened to add Ukraine to NATO. They increasingly funneled money, which by proxy helped these groups like the Azov Battalion gain a foothold, to the point where Russia felt like they had to invade. And now we have this horrific conflict, which I am against. How are you watching this video and saying, Eddie just blindly supported everything the Russian government was doing? Maybe, you could be against the Russian government when they just entered Donetsk and Luhansk. You could have said that was an invasion and an annexation plan from Putin all along. I don't know how you would come to that conclusion, but how can you watch that and think I'm just like pro-Putin, pro-Russian government, and I don't care about the Ukrainian people at all? I care about the Ukrainian people, which is why I want the U.S., my country, to stop meddling over there, right? And I can critique Russia all I want, and I will critique Russia and Putin when they do things that I think are worthy of critique, but ultimately it doesn't matter that much, because I live in the U.S. I am a socialist in the U.S. So what is the U.S. role in this conflict? The U.S. role in this conflict is supporting politicians who are friendly to neo-Nazis and continually increasing troop and weapon presence around Russia while also advancing NATO towards Russia's borders. So me, as a U.S. citizen, I am saying that needs to stop. The U.S. helped create this horrible and deadly conflict, and we need to stop it. I have critiques of Russia, I have critiques of Ukraine, but they matter much less than my critiques of the U.S. Because what the U.S. is doing here has helped create a horrible conflict that's leading to people dying. Saying that is not the same as saying I support everything Putin and the Russian military does. And, I'm never going to spend 100% of my show talking about how evil Russia and Putin are when the U.S. State Department is trying to manufacture, consent for regime change tactics like economic sanctions against Russia. Because that does the bidding of the U.S. State Department, and my time could be better used critiquing the U.S. State Department because I live in the U.S.
A lot of the time, Russian pundits point to the shelling of residential areas in the Donbass, which, mind you, did happen, but did not represent an intent to commit genocide or as evidence of an attack on ethnic Russians to exterminate them. But if we are going to look for evidence of genocide...
Okay, so the Azov Battalion, did they say that those attacks, those shelling of civilian areas were just, out of the goodness of their heart? They had to do them? There were no ethnic motivations here. Trust us. Trust the neo-Nazi battalion who's shooting people's homes, who are shelling people's homes and killing ethnic Russians en masse. They said they didn't do it, they didn't target Russians intentionally, so I'm sure they're telling the truth.
We could expect to see civilian casualties continuing from 2014 onward. After all, the Russian invasion occurred in 2022, meaning that if there was evidence of genocide, and it was so severe, we would expect to see civilian casualties continuing up to the point of the invasion. Instead, civilian deaths in the Donbass have decreased since their peak in 2014. If Russia intended to engage in a peacekeeping mission...
Of course they've decreased since 2014. 2014 was when the country was in maybe the biggest political conflict it had ever seen, one of the largest political conflicts of the entire century so far. And there was tons of fighting going on, and there was basically a war happening in the Donbass region. So yes, if you compare 2014, when there was a revolution or coup, depending on who you ask, which overthrew the Ukrainian government, a pro-Russian Ukrainian president, and put in power an anti-Russian Ukrainian president who was more kind to the neo-Nazi battalions, yes, that's going to increase fighting. And if you compare today, your 2022 to 2014, yeah, there was more fighting in 2014. That doesn't prove that fighting's not going on. That doesn't prove that there aren't ethnic crimes being committed by these neo-Nazi battalions, which after 2014 became part of Ukraine's actual National Guard, their actual military. Right, that doesn't mean they weren't still killing people in 2022, just because it wasn't as many deaths as what happened in 2014 when the country was experiencing political crisis. I mean, what a scummy argument, or an argument that just doesn't understand what 2014 was in Ukraine. What the ousting of the pro-Russian president and his replacing with a more far-right neo-Nazi anti-Russian president, what that meant for Ukraine and the fighting that led to in the Donbass region. Either Connor doesn't understand that, or he understands it and he's just making a really, really deceitful argument.
Why did they wait until years after civilian deaths peaked? Why wait for the time when civilian casualties are at the lowest ever? And this failure to base the claims in statistical evidence is not new, nor is it the first time that Eddie has claimed that ethnic violence justified the separatist movements in Donbass.
They were worried that they were going to be killed, and there have been 14,000 Russians killed by ethno-nationalist violence in this region. So Russia came into this region and basically occupied it and said, we're done allowing our people to be killed by this violence.
That's funny. While he was screen recording my personal Snapchat story, he got a news update from CNN.
Everybody's ethno-nationalist violence. If the U.S. keeps going and if Ukraine keeps going, we're going to invade Kiev. Like, we're going to invade the capital of Ukraine. We're going to take Ukraine because Ukraine really shouldn't even be a nation anyways. That's what Putin said.
Which, that was a super anti-Putin thing for me to say. You know, that was me. Putin never actually said we're going to invade Kiev and Ukraine shouldn't be a country anyways. You know, that was me saying that this invasion may go further, you know, and it may be a bad thing, and that's just what's going on. But for me to say that Putin said that, you know, is me taking Putin's words very uncharitably, right? And painting Putin in a sort of bad light, because I knew that, you know, was going to be useful for explaining this on Snapchat to people who were unfamiliar with the conflict and who just thought Putin bad, you know, have no other view of Putin except for thinking he's evil. I knew if I gave Putin's position an uncharitable view, it would help people, you know, be more likely to listen to me. But apparently I just worship Putin and I support everything Putin and the Russian government does.
So, you know, bad all around, but...
Bad all around. You hear that, Connor? Did you hear that? Bad all around. Not Ukraine bad. Not Russia bad. Not this simplistic, idiotic view that the neoliberal media wants us to take of Russia bad. Bad all around. U.S. influence bad. Neo-Nazi battalions in Ukraine bad. Russian aggression bad. All bad. But what I was saying was this is going to lead to a conflict, or, you know, what I was saying was no more conflict, was here are the steps we need to take, and here's what the U.S. needs to do to de-escalate. And here's how the U.S., the country we live in, has escalated. That doesn't mean that I think Russia is without blame, right? Or that Putin is without any kind of blame. I just gave a very uncharitable interpretation of something Putin said about the war. Right? What I'm saying is we live in the U.S. and we need to understand the U.S. role in this conflict so we can fight against it and fight against the conflict happening altogether.
Hopefully things end peacefully, and I don't think this will lead to World War III.
While there has certainly been violence in Donbass, with many people killed, the amount of Russians killed in Donbass is not 14,000. Even Russian state media outlets acknowledge that this number includes Ukrainian security forces and Russian separatists. Other organizations have given more detailed and nuanced examinations of these numbers.
Did he just say it doesn't include Russians, it includes Russian separatists? So the people who want their independence, the people fighting for their sovereignty?
Not 14,000. Even Russian state media outlets acknowledge that this number includes Ukrainian security forces and Russian separatists.
So I guess those aren't technically considered civilians because they're taking up arms. But they're taking up arms against the Ukrainian government put in power by the U.S. in 2014, who are super anti-Russian. You know, so you can say that killing those people doesn't count as Ukraine killing Russian people. But it does, because they were forced into that position.
Organizations have given more detailed and nuanced examinations of these numbers. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights found that between 2014 and 2021, between 14,200 and 14,400 people were killed, of which 3,404 were civilians, 4,400 were Ukrainian forces, and an estimated 6,500 members of other armed groups. These numbers also include suicides, dangerous weapons and equipment usage, and road accidents, so these deaths are not all intentional. Even if we include injuries, the estimates don't support the claim that Ukraine was attempting to butcher the Russian people between 2014 and 2020.
That's not what I said either. I did not say Ukraine was attempting to massacre Russian people, and this is another thing, you know, that I see with the neoliberal narrative about this sort of great men of history focus. It's like, you know, everything that happens, everything that was anti-Russian that happened in Donbass, that was Ukraine, the Ukrainian government. Well, the Azov Battalion is now part of the Ukrainian government, largely thanks to the US-backed coup in 2014. So you kind of can say that, but there are warring factions, right? There are warring factions in Donbass, and people have taken up arms because they're fighting each other for sovereignty. You know, and I'd have to look into these statistics deeper. Regardless of whether the number was 14,000 or not, you know, a lot of Russian people were being killed due to ethnic violence. And not just me making that up. Like I said, the Azov Battalion will say this. You know, they state this. They state we are anti-Russian. We want a strong Ukraine with only, you know, Ukrainian nationals. We want a nationalistic Ukraine with only Ukrainians. We don't like other ethnicities. This is their stated goal. And this has been part of the Ukrainian military since 2014. And they've been a group with a lot of foothold, you know, a lot of power in Ukraine since before that. So regardless of whether the numbers of Russian citizens being killed are off or not, you have powerful groups belonging to the Ukrainian military who are supported by the US-backed president who took power with $3 to $5 million in funding from the US. And they are committing violence in Donbass. So either way, you have ethnic violence, you know, by a group connected to the Ukrainian military against Russian civilians. So you have a problem here in eastern Donbass, even if the exact number of Russian civilians killed isn't 14,000, which, you know, I'm skeptical of the United Nations report here and of Connor's usage of statistics. I'd like to look further into it. But either way, you're just fudging the numbers here, you know, and ignoring the broader point that I'm making, which is that there are neo-Nazi battalions supported by proxy by the U.S. in Donbass, and they were killing ethnic Russians. So it makes perfect sense that ethnic Russians would want to secede from Ukraine. And then you're saying, you know, Russian separatists, those people who want to secede aren't civilians, so, you know, it's okay for the Ukrainian military to kill them. No! Just no!
An estimated 37,000 to 39,000 people were injured in the Donbass region. According to that same source, the injuries included a maximum of 9,000 civilians, 14,200 Ukrainian forces, and 16,200 members of other armed groups. For once, civilians were not the majority of the victims in the war in Donbass, though considering the Russian forces' attempts to bomb Ukrainian civilians with seemingly no concern about the rules of war, that has changed in an obvious and brutal way. And that's not even mentioning the litany of crimes that are now being alleged in Bucha. And while I am certain Eddie would consider these deaths horrific, the argument will always go back to claims of Western imperialism, while ignoring how those claims are nothing more than a cover for the Russian government.
But I thought I ignored all the specific instances of alleged human rights abuses. See, you said that, but then you said I would acknowledge what's going on in Bucha, and the video that we did right before I reacted to this video was us talking about the allegations in Bucha. And the U.S. media narrative as opposed to, you know, the narrative that's coming out of Ukraine and the narrative that's coming out of Russia. That was the very last video we talked about. And you said I would engage with those crimes in Bucha, but then you also said that I wasn't engaging with the issues on a case-by-case basis. So what is it? Am I engaging with the issues on a case-by-case basis like I just did? Am I not engaging with the issues on a case-by-case basis like you said I did? Or are you a liar?
With that out of the way, let's turn to perhaps one of the most frustrating arguments presented by Eddie Liger-Smith and his cohorts.
Stop calling me Eddie Liger-Smith, progressive American. I literally know you. We literally went to school together, and you haven't talked to me in like 2 years, and now you released a full YouTube video on me. Stop calling me Eddie Liger-Smith, bro. We know each other. Bruh.
Namely, the argument that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis and that the Ukrainian government is a Nazi.
I'm done with this. I'm done with this. I'm not explaining once again that the Ukrainian government isn't run by neo-Nazis, but there are neo-Nazi battalions who are now part of the Ukrainian military. I'm not explaining it again. I've explained like 600 times this video how the Azov battalion is a player within Ukraine and within the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but that does not mean that all of Ukraine are Nazis and all of their government are Nazis. But after 2014, after the U.S. funneled $3 to $5 million into Ukraine and their president was ousted, their pro-Russian president, with an anti-Russian president, more pro-U.S. president, the Azov battalion was made a part of Ukraine's military. That would be like the U.S. military having a neo-Nazi battalion running around. You know, and to act like that isn't a big deal is absurd. And to act like that's me saying that all of Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what anyone is saying. But in order to make these arguments of Putin evil, and every single anti-imperialist who's skeptical of the US narrative is just a Putin apologist, in order to make that narrative, you have to lie and say that we're claiming that Ukraine's run by neo-Nazis, despite the fact that nobody's ever said that. But, if that's what you guys say, if that's what you have to say to make your argument, to make me look like a Putin apologist, if you have to lie about what I actually said about the Ukrainian government and ignore the specifics of what I actually said, then, it is what it is. I hope you get the views that you wanted, Connor. I hope you get the subscribers that you wanted from that. I wish you wouldn't have taken a video from my personal Snapchat story. That was pretty weird. Please ask my permission next time. But I hope that video gave you the views that you so crave, my friend.